and there was chaos on the airplane. He was distracted, the phone went dead, and we know that 38 passengers and 7 crew died in this crash in Pennsylvania on an airplane that had, at least according to 1 or 2 sources we've spoken today in the Federal Aviation Administration environment, had asked to change its flight plan for Washington before it crashed for reasons we do not understand at this point in Pennsylvania. This has been a day, whether it's on the phone at great distance or closer up at the scene of a disaster, when people have been searching for news and connection and friends and relatives. John Quinones has one such example.
These are children who go to school right across from the Twin Towers. They were evacuated during the chaos. The faces of innocence, worried and frightened. What did you hear?
I heard a big boom.
What happened then?
And it sort of shaked.
Some kids were crying because their mom and dad were upstairs.
Among the people inside the burning towers, this little girl's father.
I was scared that my dad was still in there. Well, they're all...
You still don't know. Her name is Jane Schoenholt. Her mother, Brenda, and sister Remy.
Well, my husband works in the World Trade Center, so it was more him.
Right across the street.
And she was in the school right down there.
What went through your mind?
I love you very much.
A lot of people I know are dying.
I just want my dad, I want my animals.
Her dad, Steve Schoenholt, runs a restaurant on the concourse level of the Twin Towers.
It's a restaurant.
He spoke to his family by phone this morning after the first explosion.
Why didn't he evacuate?
I do.
Because he thinks he's too tough for those terrorists.
But they haven't heard from their father since.
So let's go find him. Come on.
We follow them for blocks and blocks throughout the disaster zone.
I'm just used to walking over here and just seeing, the Twin Towers. It's scary to see just smoke. And that's it. I mean, that's my home, and it's gone.
Just a few blocks from their home,
Everyone back on the sidewalk, please.
were stopped by police.
Fortunately, right now, until we know that it's safe, we're asking everyone to move back.
Now, the people that were evacuated from the World Trade Center, where would they be right now?
Unfortunately, they are all over.
Officer, they're looking for their father who was in the building.
I understand. Unfortunately, my wife was in the building, and I still haven't heard from my wife. So,
On a cell phone, they call to see if Steve has turned up at one of his other restaurants.
Hi, is Steve there? Steve. Yeah, okay.
Does that mean he's gone or is he still alive?
No, she just hasn't heard from him.
They continue their desperate search, past the rubble, past the screaming rescue vehicles, and then more barricades.
Okay, this is a secure location, so you can step aside and walk.
Oh.
It's a yellow light.
A secure location?
How do you feel right now?
I'm scared that my dad, we might not find him. I feel like he's alive. I just want to find him and make sure.
They run into one of their neighbors, who points them toward a police command center several blocks away.
And tell them your situation and that they will escort you to your house.
Yes, yes.
Right there at Pier 40.
Van.
Thank you.
It's another long walk, and at the end, it once again seems fruitless.
And do you know anything about when we'll be able to get in there to get our animals?
There's nothing there.
But then, as Brenda is in the middle of another desperate phone call trying to find her
It'd be
husband,
good to do that. We'll do it then.
What?
We just...
one little happy ending on a day with so much anguish and so much heart.
In the building. I cried the whole way. I saw it coming down.
Oh, no.
In search of Steve. A happy ending where there have been so few today, and God didn't know where that was going for a moment there. And when they encountered the policeman and said they were looking for their father, and he said his wife was in the World Trade Center too, that was very difficult. Mayor Giuliani reports, Mayor of New York City, that some survivors have been pulled from the rubble tonight. And that is a huge relief that some survivors have been pulled from the rubble tonight, a huge relief to all of us, and a relief, too, I'm sure, to Frank Donahue from the American Red Cross, who's a member of the National Disaster Response Team for the Red Cross and came in today from Philadelphia. And you've had experience in earthquakes before, and I thought as you sat down, you suggested there's some similarity here.
Absolutely. Coming into New York today from Philadelphia, the Holland Tunnel, that eerie kind of sound and feeling when I arrived in New York City of literally hundreds and hundreds of firefighters and police standing by, and the smoke that was all over Lower Manhattan reminded me so much of the smoke I saw over Izmit, Turkey 2 years ago when 19,000 people died in that earthquake. And there are many similarities. Tonight I was down there and they were getting phone calls, cell phone calls from the rubble. And it is that kind of experience in an earthquake. And Red Cross is there to provide backup support for the medical staff that are on scene and the disaster workers that are pulling people from the rubble and the medical staff, but to provide relief to them. Also to provide mental health support for family members like we just heard from that woman who presumably lost her son. We have Red Cross disaster workers at every airport, at LAX, at Boston's Logan, at Newark, in responding to family members that were waiting for loved ones on those flights today. And of course, Mr. Jennings, you know, the blood supply. We've
talked about it numerous times today. It's very hard to understand. Are you still looking for volunteers across the country to be giving blood?
You know, and I think it's a great reminder to all of us that our country should never be short of blood. We have about 50,000 units of blood right now ready to respond in New York City, but people throughout the country can give blood by calling 1-800-GIVE-LIFE.
Okay, just do that very slowly. 1-800-GIVE-LIFE.
Right.
You might try to figure that out numerically for some people who want to figure it out numerically, but it was a little difficult today to figure out whether there was an immediate blood shortage here, even though we know there's blood shortage in the nation as a whole.
Well, as you indicated, you know, as they're pulling people from the rubble over the next couple days, which will continue, that's when the blood will be needed. And again, it's a reminder to all of us that we always need to be ready.
What else does the National Response Team from the Red Cross do? When you say you come in to assist people, what is that?
Today we had disaster vehicles in the neighborhood responding. For example, a gentleman came up to me, had been evacuated from his house and needed his heart medication. So we would make sure we connect him up with hospitals and facility to get him that medication. People will be calling their local Red Cross throughout the United States, trying to find loved ones that were in that building on those airlines. And our local Red Cross here in Greater New York will begin to identify who goes to 13 shelters tonight that the Red Cross is running in Lower Manhattan.
As you were wandered around Lower Manhattan today, how much pressure are the hospitals really under? Hard to get a grasp of that, too.
Again, I believe that, you know, there's the number of people that have actually been pulled, the survivors, are not as many as we'd hope, and so the hospitals...
Not as many yet as we
Correct.
Hoped, right?
So the hospitals are not as full as one might think. The number of casualties that have been, you know, taken to hospitals is less than thought at this point, but that's, as you said, I think the next couple of days we'll see more.
And we don't compare this. I mean, this is comparable to an earthquake in some ways, and we had these two huge buildings that collapsed. This is an act of terrorism, as you well know. But how similar is it in terms of your hopefulness, having seen what you've seen today, that a rescue operation will at least have some measure of success?
Absolutely. I mean, I think all of us have hope that as many people as we could possibly get from the rubble will be saved. I mean, I've seen in earthquakes people buried a number of days that have come out alive, as you have as well, and that's the hope for all of us. And Red Cross and emergency workers tonight, we're feeding 10,000 folks in Lower Manhattan, disaster workers, and that's their primary job, is to try to help find people over the coming days. So Red Cross will be there with them.
Among the horrifying spectacles today, of course, for all of us, is as people fled in panic from the scene of these disasters, the police and the firemen were on their way in to try to help people going out of their way. And those two departments in New York City have suffered grievously.
Absolutely. The loss in the fire and police is significant. It is always the case, I think, when there's a disaster. There's so many people running away, and yet there are people like Red Cross volunteers and fire and police
What's the mood on the
that are
street,
moving
Mike?
in. Again, it's a sense of quietness. I think people are stunned. I don't think anyone ever could believe that that could happen right here in New York City, and I think people are just stunned. But also New Yorkers have been incredible. As I was driving up here tonight, people knocking on my window, the Red Cross vehicles, saying, I want to be a volunteer, I want to give blood, I want to help. Students from NYU coming up to me begging where they could go and help tonight. So people are responding, people wrapping police fire bands around, you know, there's bands, there's yellow bands around their arms, helping direct traffic. just like I saw in Turkey and Izmit. I mean, people respond when people need help.
Well, I very much appreciate you coming and taking the time to talk to us. Frank Donahue from the National Disaster Response Team of the Red Cross, and he has said something important. There it is on your screen here, that no matter where you are in the country is in need of blood, and in these immediate emergencies outside Washington and in New York, there will be an intense need for blood in the next couple of days. So you can call 1-800-GIVE-LIFE, excuse me, which translates numerically into 1-800-448-3543. Thanks, Mr. Donahue, very much for coming in. Frank Donahue came up from Philadelphia and just telling us what we've heard so many times today, that the mood on the street is utterly mixed, and yet everywhere you go there are people who wish to volunteer. It's interesting, he said, characteristic of the same thing he found at Izmit in Turkey, where they had those terrible earthquakes within a year ago. And it happens everywhere. The earthquake in Mexico City, I remember, same kind of thing. People just spring into action and do what it is that they can do. There are people in the country who may have tried to take advantage of it. I have a note here somewhere about the state of gasoline supplies in the country. A lot of people in the country are anxious that somehow these attacks on the states would lead to a shortage of gas supplies, have rushed to fill up. Don't mean to suggest hoard, but have certainly rushed to fill up, and there were certain people in some parts of the country who may or may not have taken advantage of this. But certainly Exxon Mobil and BP are two of the large companies which have done what they could tonight in various regions of the country to let people know that there was going to be no shortage of gasoline, no interruption of the oil supply as a result of the attacks today, and urged everybody to keep the price just where it was and not take advantage of your fellow citizens. Now, the economic ramifications of this are immediate and they are international. And Betsy Stark is still with us after these many hours to give us a summary of the impact that this has had in terms of the globalization in which we now live.
Peter, you're right that this is kind of a cautionary tale on the kind of havoc that can be wreaked on the economy. Not surprisingly, oil prices in the futures market did shoot up today on fears that there could be supply disruptions if there's an escalation of tensions, and particularly if those tensions involve the Middle East, which is a source of so much oil production. And evidence tonight that some gas stations are taking advantage of that fear. In Oklahoma, Mississippi, Missouri, and Michigan, a doubling and tripling of gasoline prices to as much as $5 a gallon. And as you say, consumers fearful that there will be shortages waiting online to fill up. But important to tell you, the American Petroleum Institute says there are no shortages of supply. Refinery production is going strong. And the only place we may expect some supply disruptions are New York City, as you can understand.
Now, on the International Financial Markets Day, the New York Exchange was closed, the American Stock Exchange was closed, and is going to stay closed tomorrow. Can you get some sense of the international ramifications as how people interpret the United States and the American economy in the wake of this?
Well, Peter, as you know, psychology is such a strong element in the way the world looks at the health of markets. And what we had today was a blow not only physically to the heart of the financial district, but also in striking the Twin Towers, the center of finance and commerce in New York City and around the world, a blow to investor confidence in the United States as in its ability to kind of continue to be the economic engine that holds the economy together at a time when not only is the U.S. economy on the verge of recession, but economies around the world are. So there's great anxiety in world markets. Our markets, as you say, will be closed tomorrow, and we won't have an announcement until tomorrow on when they will open up. But
the Japanese markets, I mean, it's now 9 o'clock in the West, a little after midnight in the East, so the Japanese, the market is open today. There's a market open somewhere, everywhere in the world. What do you see?
Well, what you see is you see investors around the world, their confidence shaken. The Japanese market opened, as you say, a couple hours ago and has gone down about 5–6%. So, you know, that's a bad day, but it's, you know, it's not a crash. I mean, you know, the global financial system has not fallen apart, Peter, but it has been shaken.
Why are the American and New York Stock Exchange is going to stay closed tomorrow? It's interesting how the political establishment, the Congress, has made a very public point of being open and doing business tomorrow. Why not the exchanges here?
Well, some of it has to do with the fact that the New York Stock Exchange is located just a few blocks from where the World Trade Center Twin Towers once stood. So it's going to be difficult in terms of transportation, in terms of safety, in terms of not interfering with the rescue operations and the cleanup of that area to actually get employees down into those down into the stock exchange. And the major financial firms, which operated out of the Twin Towers, out of the World Financial Center across the street from the Twin Towers, have also got some cleaning up to do and some damage assessment to do before they can be back to full operations.
Betsy, just join me in taking a look at your television monitor there. And here is a list of some of the companies which did business in the World Trade Center. Look at Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley had 50 floors in Tower Number 1, 12.5% of the tower owned by Morgan Stanley. Now, we do not know that all of that was devoted to Morgan Stanley investment business. They may have sublet it in some cases to other, because Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, Oppenheimer funds, all who are deeply involved in the international financial community had offices in there. And 9% of the tower, in Tower 1, of course, is the Port Authority, responsible for the bridges and the tunnels around New York. And they are all those offices, and many of their employees today lost. Anything else to add, Betsy, before we give you a break?
Well, you know, I would point out, you know, there's been some talk today that that this could be the straw that breaks the camel's back, that in the aftermath of this attack, with markets closed, planes not flying, businesses closed, consumers fearful, maybe glued to their sets, that, you know, we could see a drag on the economy that pushes us into recession. But, you know, we may also see surprising resilience in the market. So I think we don't want to be premature in saying that that only bad things will come out of this in terms of the U.S. economy.
Okay, I much appreciated, Betsy, because I think one of the things we've experienced today that is much bad as there is today, there is a sense of spirit in the country. You see it reflected to some extent in the various newspaper editorials which are beginning to reach us around the country. And while a great many of them from the East Coast to the West Coast, in the South, in the Midwest, in the Mountain States, are pretty unanimous in saying, as the Arizona Republic did, for example, make no mistake, this is war, and they're almost universal in believing that the United States should attack vigorously anyone whom we can hold, the country can hold responsible for people this. And while some, like the Miami Herald and others, do make it clear that what we've imposed are special weaknesses in the United States, they all reaffirm, as we've seen for many days, the strength of the nation as a whole, and the resilient, tried and tested as much as the nation has been today. For the second time today, we have a chance to talk to the former CIA Director, James Woolsey. Mr. Woolsey's in the Washington Bureau now. I think you were at home when I first talked to you this morning, sir. Nice to see you again. Just since we have talked to you today, I assume you've spent a lot of time on the telephone. So what have you learned, and what conclusions, if any, are you coming to this evening?
Well, we touched on this earlier, Peter, but I think that there has already been some rethinking in the United States about the World Trade Center attack in 1993 and the possibility that there may have been Iraqi government involvement in that. There's been an interesting book written by Laurie Milroy on this subject. There's a number of government officials who are interested in it. The Clinton administration seemed to think that the World Trade Center and all of the other terrorist operations were either loose associations of people who came together sort of spontaneously, maybe encouraged by a sermon in a mosque or something, to conduct a terrorist operation, or in the later years of the Clinton administration, it was Osama bin Laden. Very little attention was paid to the possibility that state sponsorship of terror might be alive and well, especially state sponsorship by Iraq. A lot of the rethinking of the World Trade Center bombing of '93 has to do with the identity of Ramzi Youssef, who is in prison out in Colorado. Youssef was possibly, not proven, but possibly involved with Iraqi intelligence. If that rethinking of '93 is accurate, then one very interesting thing about what happened today is that this operation is sort of a combination of Ramzi Youssef's two prior terrorist operations. One against the World Trade Center in '93 with the truck bomb. The other, the attempt to blow up a number of American airliners in the Pacific.
You're talking in terms of modus operandi.
Yes. Now, Ramzi Youssef is not sitting out there in solitary confinement in Colorado masterminding all this. If there's an MO, and this is only suggestive, it's not probative, it does suggest that some of the same type of thinking may have been behind what was going on in '93, '94, '95, and what went on yesterday.
Are you suggesting, Mr. Woolsey, that what we've seen today in terms of these attacks in New York and outside Washington today, an operation that may have been in somebody's mind for a considerable lengthy period, quite a lengthy period of time?
It's possible. It's quite possible that Osama bin Laden was involved in this, and indeed his group did it. But it is also possible that there was someone behind them. And one candidate is the Iraqi government. Outside chance that it was another terrorist group and the Iranian government was involved, I think that's much less likely.
And there's also the possibility at the moment, and forgive me, I mean this in the best, most respectful sense, that you and a whole lot of the rest of us don't really know a darn thing at the moment.
I confess, I have no inside information on this whatsoever. I've been a private citizen for 6.5 years. This is all just reading the press and surmise.
One of the things that caught our attention very much today, in fact, I had an inadvertent set to with Senator Hatch of Utah, who's on the Judiciary Committee, and Barbara Walters talked to Senator John Edwards of North Carolina today. They both gave, can I see Mr. Woolsey, please? Thank you. They both gave the strong impression today that they had talked to officials in the CIA today who said, in the words of Mr. Edwards, Senator Edwards, there'd been real progress made in the very first hours after this thing had occurred. And I express disbelief. What do you?
Well, it's possible that they picked up some intelligence either just before or just after the events that led them to suspect someone or some group, quite possibly Osama bin Laden. But that doesn't necessarily mean he was in it alone.
How good do you think Osama bin Laden is, and how much tendency has there been in the United States government to zero in, to focus in on him, as somebody observed to me earlier today, because we need the face of an enemy?
Well, he's worth several $100 million, and that goes a long way in countries where he's been based in the past, such as Sudan, and has been recently, such as Afghanistan. He has a number of followers. He is dedicated, and he has people who work for him who hate the United States deeply. So there is at least I think, a reasonable chance that on certainly the East African bombings and perhaps some of these other terrorist operations, he has been directly and immediately involved, including the Cole. But it doesn't mean that there's no one behind him working with him or guiding him or suggesting approaches or helping with false identities and travel documents and all the rest. And the prime candidate there would have to be, not proven, but would have to be Iraq, I believe.
Do you sense, or do you have any knowledge that bin Laden has been anywhere else but Afghanistan? It is conventionally believed that he is protected by the Taliban government, which has led people like the former Assistant Secretary of State Larry Eagleburger to suggest tonight that the Taliban should be attacked directly by the United States if they're found to be complicit in this.
The Taliban has certainly been harboring him, but they may have been his hotel, not, to mix a metaphor, not the Wizard of Oz behind the scene pulling the levers. That role would far more be likely to be in the hands of Iraq than this very chaotic conservative government of Afghanistan.
I don't expect a former director of the CIA to be particularly critical of the CIA today. But I think we believe that nobody in the United States government or its intelligence agencies knew this was going to happen today or had any kind of an inkling that we have heard a whisper about today. Do you think the CIA and the other intelligence agencies in the country are as good as they need to be?
No, they're not as good as they need to be. I think they're the best in the world, but they're not as good as they need to be, because in this business, you have to be perfect. It's like playing goalie on a hockey team with any goal scored against you being absolutely deadly. You have to stop everything. And the CIA and the rest of the intelligence community and the FBI did a good job back around the time of Y2K in stopping several terrorist incidents, and they've stopped a number of others that have not been publicized. But you have to stop them all, and you need enough good intelligence to be able to either stop them or help other people, law enforcement or the military, stop them, and this one was a terrible, terrible tragedy.
Now, Mr. Woolsey, we're grateful for the time that you have given us today and the knowledge that you bring to this subject. Thank you very much. I hope you won't go too far away, or at least we'll know where to find you.
It's good to be with you.
In the hours and the days ahead. I want to now bring in our principal military analyst for many years, Tony Cordesman, who's in our Washington Bureau, and has devoted an enormous amount of time over the years to writing, studying, and publishing about military and terrorism in the Middle East, from Afghanistan all down through the Persian Gulf. Tony, you there?
Yes, I am, Peter.
What are your observations on these discussions we have been having about terrorism and who might be responsible today?
I think the problem is we all know who the usual suspect is. That's Osama bin Laden. We also know that there are three nations that have strong hostile elements: Iraq, Syria, and Iran. And all of these countries could have played some role. What we don't have is any evidence as yet that we know exactly the role that either Osama bin Laden personally played or that any government played, whether it is the Afghan government or the other three governments I've mentioned. More than that, people have talked, I think, rather carelessly about attacking leaders. But how do you find a leader? How do we find Osama bin Laden? If we attack Afghanistan, do we attack a city, a power plant? Because we can't find the theocrats that rule it. They don't live in government buildings, and blowing them up doesn't really get to the leadership. So I think that we've heard a natural reaction, almost overreaction. But what we haven't heard is how we are going to this time attack the leaders responsible when we didn't do this in the case of Beirut or Al-Khobar, or for that matter, Pan Am 103.
But Tony, it's clear, I think, to everybody that the bar has been raised higher than it's ever before. This is an attack on the U.S. mainland. This has been described in virtually every editorial in the country today. We heard from every politician this is an act of war. And so why should the bar not be raised higher? Why should the country not be thinking of attacking the leaders if they're in any way complicit in these attacks today?
Well, I think we should consider attacking the leaders. That's not the issue. We have to make sure that they are A, guilty, and B, we can actually target them, and we have the means to kill them. And in doing so, we don't simply attack civilians or people who are not guilty. And that is really the problem. And it's one thing to talk about a nation like Afghanistan, which is remarkably unpopular and whose leadership have virtually no supporters. And it is quite another to talk about effectively launching another Gulf War against Iraq, a massive war against Iran, or being caught up in any effort that might involve Syria in the middle of a second intifada when we already face the backlash from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Points well taken, Tony. Let me just try to separate a couple of things out before we let you go on this. You're talking on one hand about an issue of morality and how the United States as a democratic nation will behave, and you're at the same time, it seems to me, talking about tactical operation. Let's just talk tactics for a second. If the President of the United States, are you still there? Decided,
yes,
thank you, can't see you. If the President of the United States decided he was going to launch an attack on, quote, the leadership, unquote, of the Taliban, what would be the chances of success? What effect would it have?
Well, if he announces it, there's a very good chance they'd simply disperse,
I'm
and we
sorry.
find it almost impossible to find them.
I'm sorry, I take that back. If the President launched an attack, not announced it in public first, of course.
Well, he'd probably have to use aircraft. Cruise missiles aren't really precise or reliable enough. We'd have to put in a major air task force so we could find the target and make sure we could protect the aircraft. To do that, we would have to have some kind of really good real-time intelligence on the ground, because we are talking about leaders that move. And we would have to be sure that in the process, we didn't create a political backlash. It's not simply an issue of morality by killing people who are innocent,
Tony,
which means we have to monitor the attack as it occurs.
Tony, the loss within the last several days of one of Afghanistan's leading anti-Taliban militia leaders, is this an enormous loss to the United States in terms of intelligence inside Afghanistan? He was assassinated and we believe has died, according to the reports out of Afghanistan.
Well, it could be, but we don't know as yet whether there is some other leader, and we don't know whether this movement will survive or actually react to this suicide bombing by being stronger. And we just don't know yet, Peter.
Okay, and last question for now. The Russians, so to show we have half our mind in the Cold War today, the Russians have offered cooperation with their intelligence services in Afghanistan, according to congressional sources tonight, talking to Linda Douglas. Is that a realistic suggestion? Can the United States and Russia cooperate in a meaningful way on terrorism?
I think in some ways we already have been, and oddly enough, we've even talked to the Iranians about terrorism in Afghanistan. There'll be real questions about how good the FIS in Russia really is, but certainly they're going to be very careful. Any information they give us, they're going to have been checking out. They're not going to be embarrassed if they can possibly avoid it.
Thank you very much, Tony. I really appreciate it. Tony Kortersman, who's been our longtime military analyst, and I said spends an enormous amount of time producing enormous amount of material for us to absorb on this extraordinarily complicated issue. We're also joined briefly by ABC's Judith Kipper, who is in our Washington bureau as well, and I don't doubt, knowing Judith Kipper, who's worked for us for many years now, that she has been on the phone to every person she knows east of the Mediterranean tonight. What have you learned, Judith?
Well, Peter, it's very interesting. I got a number of emails from friends in the region and journalists and others saying, is the United States now going to take a different tact in the Arab-Israeli conflict? And I was quite surprised by that the first impression was that somehow this would teach us a lesson and that we would be more responsive and more active in trying to resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict. I think we're really at a crossroads in terms of the Middle Eastern region, if this turns out to be Middle Eastern perpetrators, because it's really going to be a question now of those who really are with us and those who are not, those who can really condemn this, take actions to cooperate, and to move toward eliminating actions against civilians as something that is quasi-acceptable in the region. And it's going to be very hard for a lot of our allies in the Arab world.
And as you listen to as you take the temperature, if you will, of the Middle East today, we've heard people in many of the Middle Eastern nations deeply depressed by this attack. We've heard other people applauded in public. What temperature do you think the thing is running at?
I think people are confused, fearful of retaliation, knowing that more instability and scary things are in front of them. And, you know, the one country that hasn't been mentioned very much is Pakistan, and the U.S. is going to have to reevaluate that relationship if it turns out that this is an Osama bin Laden operation. Okay,
thanks, Judith, very much. Appreciate you coming in as well. You can just feel, I hope and sense, as I do in our coverage, that we're thanks, Judith, very much. Judith Kipper, who's been in our Washington bureau. We're going back and forth on this story. We have this enormous human tragedy in one case, which we try to cover, and then this enormous challenge to the United States government. The United States is a nation, but the United States government, and what the United States is going to do about it. What does it know at this point, which appears to be very little. But this tendency, fueled somewhat by the analysts who study the history of international terrorism and by a couple of observations by Senators Graham of North Carolina tonight, and Senator Edwards of North Carolina and Senator Hatch of Utah today, that the CIA at this point has picked up in its monitoring of telephone conversations post the attack some contact between supporters of Osama bin Laden. And it makes sense in most everybody's mind that on an occasion like this, Osama bin Laden is one of the prime suspects, just based on the history of the whole thing. And it's also probably very important for us to remember, as Judith Kipper points out, that the United States in the region and in the Muslim world generally is seen very much as a staunch and unswerving and sometimes indiscriminating ally of Israel. So there are Palestinians and people in the Arab world tonight who believe that if they punish the United States, they're punishing Israel. If they punish the Israelis in their conflict with the Palestinians at the moment, it's also important to punish the United States. But let us come back now to the immediacy of the tragedy. WCVB, ABC's station in Boston, reports tonight that, that one car has been taken away from Logan Airport in Boston, which there is some, they want to know whether or not this was a vehicle that was used by one of the people who hijacked an American Airlines or United Airlines plane out of Boston today. Let me just read quickly what it says. We are able to report that it was a Mitsubishi Mirage. It had Virginia plates. We haven't got the license plate number yet. FBI Forensics has the car at an off-site garage. It was actually towed by the state police. Included in the 6 bags of evidence confiscated by the FBI were chairs that the suspected terrorist may have sat in at the airline terminal, and the FBI hopes to pull DNA off the seats in the airport. And there again you see an advance in science in terms of investigating innocence and criminality. We see it in the prison system in the country as a whole, and we see the FBI bringing to bear very quickly the notion that DNA may be a clue here. But as we know, these terrorists got on 2 of these planes in Boston, which were intended to make transcontinental flights, and hijacked both of them and headed for New York City. And Logan Airport officials now confirm that reporting from ABC's affiliate in Boston, WCVB. And then the officials at Logan Airport, probably reflecting what's going to happen at a lot of airports around the country now tonight. The director of aviation there, Tom Kenton, said he expects that what we're going to get at Logan Airport and certainly others around the country is very quickly instituted a measure of security at the airport similar to that which was in place during the Gulf War. Much greatly reduced access to the side of the airport, and much greatly reduced access for people to the passenger areas unless they're flying, and there'll be identification checks. In other words, all of the things that the country had to become accustomed to through the Gulf War may now be put in place again. And we'll get some sense of that when the Congress meets again tomorrow, because we know they're going to pass legislation which will, in the first instance, undoubtedly be in support of the president, who gets very high marks from a lot of people today for that speech that he made in the White House tonight. And beyond the support for the president, there will be legislation, we don't doubt for a second, introduced very quickly to increase the number of resources which are available to counterterrorism in the United States, to some urging of a better coordination among federal agencies, and a greater legal authority. It's the dangerous one perhaps in the minds of many Americans, more legal authority for federal agencies to impose on people's freedoms in the country in order to conduct this campaign, this investigation against terrorism. And you saw in our poll tonight that many people agreed it was worth giving up some of their freedoms, at least in the short run, according to a very quick snap poll we took, if it aided the investigation. Back to the people themselves. ABC's Lynn Scher, who spent an early part of the day very focused on the aircraft and the passengers, has now, I think, Lynn, put together a piece for us on what we do know about people who have been victims today.
Peter, that's right. You remember what President Bush said a little bit earlier today. He said the victims were in airplanes in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Well, here are some of who they were. Olson, former federal prosecutor, more recently a TV commentator, was on American Flight 11 that left Dulles Airport for Los Angeles. She was also the wife of U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. Mrs. Olson called her husband on a cell phone to report that the plane had been hijacked and that at least 2 men had herded the passengers into the rear of the plane. She asked her husband what she should do. Then the plane crashed into the Pentagon. David Angel of Pasadena, California, was one of the creators of Frasier, the TV show. He and his wife Lynn were on American Flight 11 from Boston, the one that crashed into the first World Trade Center tower. There were at least 2 highly placed computer executives among the victims. Daniel Lewin, age 31, was co-founder and chief technical officer of Akamai, an internet infrastructure company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He leaves a wife and 2 sons. Edmund Glazer, 41, of Chatsworth, California, was an executive at MRV Communications, a leading California fiber optics company. He, too, was on the Boston to Los Angeles flight, and he leaves a wife and son. There were 2 prominent members of the professional ice hockey community. Garnet Ace Bailey, director of pro scouting for the Los Angeles Kings hockey team, once a star player himself, was on United 175 headed from Boston to Los Angeles. Ace Bailey was 53 and is survived by his wife and son. On the same flight was Mark Bavitz, an amateur scout for the LA Kings. We know some of the crew members' names on that flight. Al Marchand was a flight attendant from Alamogordo, New Mexico, a former police lieutenant who went to work for United after retiring from police work. He wanted to be a pilot. The man who was the pilot of that flight was Victor Saraceni of Lower Makefield Township, Pennsylvania. A neighbor described him as a great guy with a wife and 2 children. I'm sure, said the neighbor, he fought to the end. The pilot of American 11, the first plane to hit the World Trade Center, was John Oganowski, 52, of Massachusetts. And there are more, of course, many, many, too many more. The airlines are not releasing complete passenger manifests yet, citing security reasons. We'll be hearing a lot more of those names tomorrow. Peter?
Thanks, Lynn, very much. Giving personality and life, in essence, or personality to the people who were involved in these disasters today. And we'll run that piece again, I think, fairly soon now, because we've been so slow for all the obvious reasons and so unable to attach lives and personalities and families and connections to the people who have suffered and died in these instances. So that's a big step forward. Thanks very much, Lynn. Just 2 remarks quickly about that piece. There was a lot of focus there on Dennis Potvin, who goalkeeper in that game there for Colorado at the moment, and it was not Dennis Potvin, even though you saw a lot of him and his jersey there. It was not Dennis Potvin we were talking about as a victim on one of those aircraft today. And ABC's Pierre Thomas, who covered the FBI and was the first person to raise with us here today the value of the passenger manifests in terms of trying to focus on the perpetrators of this themselves, has proven to be extremely valuable. You hear from Logan Air Base and from Boston tonight that the FBI is all over the airport, all over the car, all over a car that may have been used by the terrorists today in order to give personalities and connections to them as well. So the investigation inches forward. And for the country as a whole, I think some time ago, several hours ago, we ran a fairly lengthy piece which we had put together, which was just simply scenes of today. We take no pleasure in reviewing these scenes for you time and again, except trying to get you closer to the reality of what has actually been happening on the ground. But this has been one of those days when news agencies share information. It's a competitive world, but we have shared information today, giving each other access to material which has helped the country get closer to what has happened. And this is the most recent piece that we get courtesy of CNN, yet one more angle on the attack on the Trade Center today. We have seen that earlier today from a freelance photographer who shot it down below, and now we see it again from another angle today, courtesy of CNN, who shows the power of an aircraft going at speed, absolutely going into one of the two trade towers today. And we thank CNN, we all thank each other for sharing today in a state of national emergency, the information that we have available to each other. Here's a piece we prepared and ran some hours ago, which I hope makes a contribution to the rest of you in the country as to just some of the turmoil that occurred on the ground.
Let's just get back. Get back. You want to be gone?
What are we in, 3 World Financial Center? We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
Give him in. Give him in. You can walk. You can film it. Okay. Take go. Give him in.
As soon as he got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs, burnt up. It's bad.
There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
Anything else that you saw? Were you there for the second hit by the plane?
About 10 minutes later, the second building went off.
Did you see it?
Yes, I saw it. It just blew up. A big explosion. People started running. It was just chaos everywhere. People jumping out. People just kept jumping and jumping and jumping. And you could still see they were alive because they were flailing around.
A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
He's not in a live truck. I know.
Jerry, try and shoot this. Try and shoot this as we run, Jerry. Try and shoot this.
This way, straight up. Put your mask on. Put your mask on. Put your mask on. Stop putting it down.
Oh my God, there it goes.
okay, officer?
Standing next to One World Trade Center, and then all of a sudden I heard rumbling, and we all started running away from it. The glass like blew out and threw me onto the sidewalk, and I couldn't see for like 20 seconds.
We came from the 82nd floor, and I don't know where my peers are. I don't know. I hope to God they're okay. That's all I can say. I don't know what. We saw a shadow. It looked like a plane. Next thing we know, it was boom, boom, and the floor started shaking.
Right behind us.
It's a war. We've been attacked. It's like World War II.
This is so terrible. Can't even look at it. Because all I can see are people. I don't see a building, I see people. People hurt. Children without mothers and fathers tonight.
Well, I don't mean this to be self-serving in terms of news gatherers, but we have a lot to thank camera teams and our own ABC News camera teams and the freelancers today who've contributed to all of this, who've helped us to understand the magnitude of this. You just run through those pictures again, and you appreciate, first of all, the danger and the immensity of the tragedy. There's the dust everywhere, the dust and the debris everywhere. It could indeed be an earthquake in some rural place, as we've seen in Turkey and Mexico and Armenia and other places, where everything just gets simply buried. It's small compared to what's happened to entire communities in the past, in that it's in a fairly self-contained area it's a very small area in downtown in New York City, at the very tip of the island of Manhattan, adjacent to the Hudson River. You see all those papers, which are businesses and lives, going up, and then you hear a woman there just simply saying all the children tonight who do not have mothers and fathers, and there is the confusion and there is the panic and those constant pictures of the firefighters. Mayor Giuliani said not too long ago, confirmed that 3 senior members of the New York Fire Department and indeed had lost their lives. And we have believed for some hours now that, that as many or perhaps more than 200 firefighters have lost their lives. And you think of what an enormous event when a single firefighter loses his or her life, mostly his life, in any community in the United States, in most parts of which we have volunteer fire departments. And here we have one of the most professional fire departments in the city and has lost 200 members of its force, according to virtually every source we've talked to in this instance. And then there is the exhaustion, because the rescue teams and the salvage teams, whatever you want to call them at the moment, have been working now since 8 o'clock this morning Eastern Time, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning here in New York City, 3 hours earlier, as everybody knows, on the West Coast. But everybody's been engaged in this, which was why probably Governor Pataki and others have said that volunteers in the form of doctors and nurses are going to be needed, because as determined as people in the fire department are, for example, to stay on the job, because in many cases it's their comrades they're trying to rescue or look for, just makes it very clear the level of exhaustion which many firefighters must feel at this moment. ABC's Chris Cuomo has spent part of today focused just on the fire department, and here is his report on what it's been like for firefighters today.
An unprecedented terrorist attack. While thousands fled for safety, New York City firefighters were heading straight into the blast.
As soon as this happened, people were calling on the phone, every station in the city, how can I help, how can I help?
But with buildings of this size and fires of this magnitude, on this day, even their best wasn't enough.
We tried our best, and it was just too much. It was unbelievable. For me, it was.
When the towers showed signs of collapsing, they scrambled to escape. Most made it, but some couldn't get out fast enough. Exactly how many, we may not know for days.
Firehouse. All right, Mark Brown along with Laura Diaz. Good evening. We are continuing our local coverage of the events that have taken place in this nation. We want to take you out to Parker Center right now. We're a press conference, a final briefing of the evening. That is LA City Council President Alex Padilla.
And our prayers with the victims and the families of the victims of the various incidents that took place earlier today. We've been monitoring the news, as many of you have, about the updates and investigations, updates and activities of the various incidents in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania and others. But our job here in the city of Los Angeles has been first and foremost to ensure the safety and security of the residents and the families of the city of Los Angeles. As of 10 p.m. this evening, it is once again my pleasure to announce that there are no credible threats targeting the city of Los Angeles. We do not, at this point in time, have a threat to our safety. The Los Angeles Emergency Operations Center will continue to be active. It was activated prior to 7 a.m. this morning and will continue to stay active overnight. It'll allow us and the city family to continue to monitor the city of Los Angeles to ensure our safety. Will also allow us to stay in touch with the federal agencies so that we can monitor possible changes or progress overnight, not only in Southern California, but throughout the country. But given the relative calm that we've experienced here in Southern California today and the expected calm we hope to have overnight, we want to share with the public that we expect to return to normal come tomorrow. Schools will remain in session, the buses will remain on the road, the trash will be picked up, and we do expect city employees back to work as normal. So once again, for city employees, particularly here at the Civic Center, we expect full operation and full city activity. We have a website available for people wanting traffic information tomorrow. It'll be the first day back after some chaos this morning. So for people with access to the internet, there's a website, trafficinfo.gov. airport.lacity.org that you can access for information about our roads and our highways here in the city of Los Angeles. As far as our airports are concerned, they remain closed. We've gone through the procedures necessary to ensure their safety and security locally, and we're simply awaiting FAA clearance to reopen those airports. One note of progress is our port in San Pedro, our harbor. Our harbor has reopened, and with advanced and additional security measures is now allowing ships to enter our harbor. As far as the courthouses are concerned, all federal courthouses and all federal buildings for that matter will remain closed. Those are a matter of jurisdiction of the federal government. But we've been informed that the Los Angeles Superior Courthouses will be open. And for those people who are possibly on jury duty at this time, you must report as instructed. I spoke once again with Mayor Hahn just over an hour ago, and he continues to be in good spirits. He's still in Washington, D.C., and is anxious to get back to the city of Los Angeles as soon as possible. Finally, I want to mention a note, a calling to the city of Los Angeles. One of the greatest assets that we have in this city, something we point to with pride, is our diversity. But at no point is our tolerance and our understanding of various cultures and heritages tried than times like these. And so we call upon all Angelenos to not allow the anger or the grief that we may be experiencing today to develop into hate or discrimination against any other human being, any other Angeleno. We encourage people not to jump to conclusions about the sources or origins of this morning's activity, and ask us to recognize that Los Angeles can once again show leadership by demonstrating how we can come together in the days and the weeks ahead. As I mentioned in the beginning, tonight, Los Angeles is safe. And if anything, we're in a privileged position to be able to help our fellow Americans get through this